Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Gene Positive Podcast. I'm your host, Diane Campbell, and in this episode, I'm going to be sharing about my story and personal connection to Huntington's disease. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I haven't always been open to discussing, accepting, or sharing about the impactful realities of Huntington's disease. Despite my best efforts, I never had the foundation, knowledge, tools, understanding, or capacity to effectively support myself or members of my family with the dynamic and complex aspects of this disease. It's only been in recent years of my life where I've started to feel increasingly comfortable sharing about my experiences and journey with this disease. Even now, I find it incredibly difficult to combine all the parts and pieces without trauma, anxiety, and grief flooding in. Since testing gene positive in 2024, I promised myself that I'd disconnect from patterns that no longer serve me, commit to healing, learning, and growing, and taking the narrative of my future into my own hands as much as I could. I also want to recognize that I'm not an expert when it comes to Huntington's disease. Everything I share comes from my personal lived experience, my own reflections, thoughts, and emotions, and what I've learned from others along the way. There are countless stories and experiences within the Huntington's community, and no single one defines the disease in its entirety. My hope is that by sharing my journey, I can create a safe space for yours to exist. The last thing I wanted to mention is that this episode will be sharing my story at a higher level. But with honesty and transparency, there have been serious themes and triggering events that I've been witness to and have been deeply afflicted by. At this time, I'm choosing not to go into specific details out of respect and privacy. But it's important to me that I validate this experience for those who have gone through or may be going through similar struggles. Huntington's first entered my life when I was a preteen. Although there may have been conversations about Huntington's taking place around me prior, the first memory I have of the disease is when my mom returned from a trip where she was visiting my Nana in another country. My Nana had been recently hospitalized and diagnosed with complications of the disease. I remember my mom sharing the heartbreaking news with us and explaining the devastating condition my Nana was in, as she was experiencing significant motor dysfunction, cognitive decline, and psychiatric issues. I remember my mom being deeply distressed, shocked, and traumatized from her interactions with my Nana. From that moment on, Huntington's wasn't something that my family talked about openly, as it brought too much fear, uncertainty, and devastation. From that moment, my mom decided that she never wanted to find out if she was positive for the disease. From that moment, for the majority of my life, my relationship and understanding of this disease would be solely rooted in my mom's experiences, thoughts, and beliefs. As I grew up, I began to research and develop a basic understanding of the disease. I was lucky enough to have a few extended family members reach out and check in and share their knowledge and understanding of how the disease has existed genetically in our family lineage. However, even after those conversations, Huntington's was never something I thought would exist in my own orbit. From my mid-teenage years into my mid-20s, a significant portion of my mental, emotional, and physical energy was spent supporting and caring for my undiagnosed mom. At that time, she was struggling with what we understood to be diverse, impactful, chronic mental health issues. During this time, my mom exclusively requested assistance from only my family members, and unfortunately always rejected any suggestion or offering of professional resources, aid, or support. As my mom's condition got progressively worse, my family did our absolute best with the tools we had at the time to manage and navigate her undiagnosed symptoms. However, in my mid-20s, I experienced massive burnout and had made the decision for myself to step back from caretaking and having a relationship with my mom. This was something that was incredibly difficult to navigate. I knew how much I needed to prioritize my mental health and well-being after so many years, but I also felt a tremendous amount of guilt distancing from my mom, who I still cared about and loved, and felt incredibly heavy knowing my family would have to care for my mom and her increasingly complex situations without me. As my mom's symptoms worsened, her ability to keep up with her daily living diminished significantly, and unfortunately, her safety was jeopardized on many occasions. Against my mom's will, my family worked incredibly hard to advocate for her well being, tirelessly imploring and fighting for professional and social support to step into her circle of care. It wasn't until a few years ago, when my mom was deemed unable to take care of herself anymore, that a family member was finally able to get the care and support my mom desperately required all along. They were finally able to get her into a care home where she would receive multidisciplinary support from a team of qualified and trained professionals. During this time, my family was finally able to get my mom tested for Huntington's, and we received confirmation that she was gene positive and in the middle to late stages of the disease. This is when Huntington's became even more personal for me. Firstly, receiving confirmation that my mom was positive felt heartbreaking. Given how the past 2 decades had transpired, deep down, I wasn't surprised that it was the case. It felt like after spending my whole life existing with uncertainty, I finally knew the truth. Secondly, it was guaranteed that I had a 50-50 chance of inheriting the disease. I spent a lot of time weighing the pros and cons that came with genetic testing. There are so many considerations when it comes to mental health, relationships, family planning, careers, finances, insurances, and so many more things. It wasn't until a year later when I finally felt confident enough with myself, grounded enough in my life, and supported with strong relationships that I could take on genetic testing and whatever results would transpire. For me, it felt like growing up, there was always fear and uncertainty in the unknown, and I knew I didn't want that for myself or my future. I didn't know how yet, but it was really important to me that I set myself and the people in my life up for success as best as I possibly could. This was a decision that I made for myself, but I kept the people I loved and trusted the most looped in along the way. This was something that had been heavy my entire life, and I wanted to make sure I had support when I needed it the most. There were a lot of different thoughts and emotions leading up to and during the testing process. I remember this being a really heavy time as it brought up a lot of fears of the past and anxieties of the future. It was a lot to maintain and regulate while still trying to keep some normalcy in my day-to-day life. I went into genetic testing feeling confident that I was going to be gene negative. I'd been relatively healthy and an active person my entire life, and I couldn't conceptualize being gene positive. On my third appointment of genetic testing, the genetic counselor shared that I was gene positive for Huntington's disease. When the appointment finished, it felt like my entire world collapsed in seconds. I fell to the floor in shock, started to hyperventilate. My body started shaking. It felt like time stopped in those moments, and I just went completely numb. I remember crying a lot. I remember connecting with all the people I love, one by one, having my heart break each time I shared the news. I remember feeling like everything I knew about myself and my life was lost in uncertainty. I took the news a lot harder than I thought I would, and it took me a really long time to bounce back and recover from it. At first, it was just moment by moment and day by day. I had no idea how I was supposed to identify with this disease, especially when I was still healthy with no symptoms. I had no idea how I was supposed to accept this as a piece of myself when it's been something I've feared my entire life. I felt like all of my hopes and dreams no longer mattered. I felt like I didn't deserve all of the good and love I had in my life. I questioned absolutely everything about myself, my existence, and my mortality. But while all of this was happening, so was my life outside of Huntington's. I still had date nights with my partner, friends and family to laugh on the phone with, a workplace to contribute to, places to travel, concerts to go to, photos to take, food to try, a body to move, and so many other things I loved, cared about, and was excited for. Over time, all of these things started to create a sense of normalcy again, and I started to understand the importance of valuing my existence as someone who is gene positive, but also valuing my existence for who I am outside of this disease. This is something I'm continuously working on, trying to hold space for both of these realities at the same time. After some months had passed, finally felt ready to join a few Huntington's disease support groups and started attending personal counseling sessions. When I first started in support groups, I was very quiet. I didn't share a lot. I was just happy to be listening and learning. It was the first time outside of my experience with my mom that I was meeting people who had the disease for themselves or in their families. It was a really valuable, inspiring, and healing experience for me because it redefined what I knew about the disease, how people existed with it, but most importantly, how they thrived with it. When I first started to open up and share, I found it really difficult to know where to start with it all. It wasn't ever something I talked about openly, and I found it really challenging not to overthink everything and get caught up in my own trauma tornado. Over time, as I kept working on myself and putting time into my healing, I started to be able to express myself more comfortably and fluidly. I still get anxiety trying to find the best ways to express myself or tell my story, but I've learned that just doing it is the most important part. Support groups have been and continue to be one of the most impactful places for me to heal and grow, more than I ever knew was possible. These groups give me a sense of community that I never had before, a space for belonging and support, and most importantly, a place where people truly understand the complexities of Huntington's without having to explain it. It was during one of my first support group sessions when I had an unexpected realization. I remember a question was asked to the group about a topic where I ended up being the only person who had lived experience with it. I remember second guessing myself in that moment, thinking that sharing my experience or reflection didn't matter, that my experience was one of millions, and I definitely was not going to be changing anyone's life, truth, or reality. But as the group sat quiet for a moment, I decided I would step up and share what I knew and how I felt to the best of my ability. Not because I had an ego to fill, not because I thought I was an expert, but because I knew what it felt like to be on the other side of these experiences, sitting in the fear of it all, with no one to help guide you through. After I finished sharing, several members of the group shared their gratitude and appreciation for my honesty and vulnerability. This was the first time in my life that all of the adversity and hardship I experienced from the disease turned into something powerful, meaningful, and supportive. I finally understood that everything I went through and experienced wasn't for nothing, that I had the ability to positively impact others by sharing about my journey. In addition to my loved ones, support groups, and counseling, I attribute the healing, growth, and acceptance that I have experienced so far to those who continue to bravely share their stories, both publicly and privately. Since my gene positive diagnosis, I made it my mission to seek out people in this community whose character I admired, whose authenticity I wanted to emulate, and whose outlook on life I wanted to embrace. As I come to the end of sharing my story, my hope is to continue passing forward the same kindness, honesty, and support that others gave me when I needed it the most. If you are listening today and are carrying fear, grief, uncertainty, or questions about your own journey, know there's still space for hope alongside all of it. Wherever you are, I hope you know you're not alone. Your story matters, and there's still so much life waiting to be lived. That's all for this episode of the Gene Positive Podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for taking the time to be gene positive with me.